Welcome back to class. This is American Federal Government, and my name is Ken Hicks. We've been learning about dimensions of federal government that relate to personal freedom. Last week we spent a great deal of time discussing the challenges related to civil liberties, how we protect our rights to freedom of expression, freedom from arbitrary arrest, freedom from cruel and unusual punishment, the right to basically keep a federal system of government. All of these are bound up within the Bill of Rights. We're talking about the analog to that this week in the idea of civil rights. Now, if we have civil liberties, why do we need civil rights? And the reality is that we have systematically over time not always extended civil liberties to certain groups of people. We have found reasons to believe that some groups of people are less meritorious of those fundamental rights. I was brought to mind of this when just kind of watching the final days of the 2024 presidential election campaign, and it came out in North Carolina. There is a guy that is running for governor. His name is Mark Robinson. He is the current lieutenant governor. He is a black man, and he is a Republican. The story broke on CNN that Robinson had made some really controversial posts on various sites that you probably wouldn't want to be associated with. Pornographic sites, and he had made comments about, he had described himself as a black Nazi. It's interesting to me, I was in graduate school when Spike Lee made the controversial statement that black people can't be racist. Evidently, Spike Lee had never met Mark Robinson. Mr. Lee's argument was that you cannot be racist if you can't put your words into actions and actually oppress other people. Robinson basically, I think, suggests that that's not necessarily true. This is a man who is an elected official who describes members of the LGBTQ community as filth, and those words have power. Those words enable people, and they signal to people that there are certain folks whose rights they don't need to respect. And so the idea of civil liberties presumes with it this notion that due process requires that people who have been denied their rights have an opportunity for redress. And that really is what civil rights claims are about. Okay? So what are we going to learn about today? We're going to talk a little bit about civil rights and how they are achieved. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the civil rights movement from the 1600s to the 1960s, okay, which was especially the 1950s and 60s were a dramatically transformative period in American history and government, because that was really a period where civil rights and civil liberties were really, it was a time of enormous tumult, and there was a lot of civil rights movements that were operating kind of all at the same time. And they all began kind of achieving, broader acceptance, for the rights of those members and their claims to equal access to civil liberties and equal protection under the laws. A lot of critics of that have made the argument that this was also the period where you saw the rise of identity politics, where people began identifying themselves not simply as Americans, but also as members of groups that had some sort of grievance and some sort of claim to greater protection than they had previously been afforded. So what are civil rights and how are they achieved? I've been talking about this, in simple terms, civil rights are guarantees of equal opportunity and protection of the law through obligations imposed on governments to protect individuals and members of groups who have been previously in a disfavored category. So there are two important distinctions between civil liberties and civil rights: how they're established and how they are protected. In simple terms, civil liberties are established under the Bill of Rights, under the first 10 amendments to the Bill of Rights. Civil rights claims are actually established under the 14th Amendment, and in particular, the aspect of that amendment that deals with guarantees of due process of law and equal protection under the law. Americans generally accept the basic principle of civil rights, but how they are applied, of course, is subject to fierce debate. Many conservatives acknowledge America's past discrimination, but they argue that the way to get past that discrimination is not necessarily through affirmative action programs or what they call reverse discrimination, but rather simply by ending the existing discrimination and allowing people to pursue their ends. Liberals generally disagree with that notion and argue that past discrimination places people at a durable disadvantage, and that oftentimes those disadvantages are conferred upon children and contribute to poverty, contribute to ongoing oppression, and that affirmative actions need to be taken to give people those opportunities that they had previously been denied. So how do we go about achieving civil rights? They're generally secured through the efforts of social movements. Social movements are sustained campaigns brought by and on behalf of disadvantaged populations in support of a political or social goal. Now, again, that's how it relates to civil rights. But there are social movements, and this is an important aspect of American politics, that the success of civil rights movements also oftentimes lead to counter mobilizations of reactionary forces that are basically saying, we don't think these people should be treated specially. So you oftentimes get the politics of collective action, again, the process of a group of people organizing based on a shared goal, which is how the Black Lives Matter movement came to be a nationalized social movement. After a series of black men were killed, oftentimes in police-involved situations, it began connecting. It happened in Ferguson, Missouri. It happened in New York City. It ultimately happened in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and those little brief flare-ups gradually kind of created a national movement. So even when a group enjoys significant public support, groups may struggle to achieve their goals, again, because, as I mentioned, even as the Black Lives Matter movement was getting started and taking to the street and protesting, and there was, the thing that was distinct about the Black Lives Matter marches of the summer of 2020 was just how multiracial and multicultural it was. Very often civil rights marches have taken place. They're predominantly comprised of the people who are part of that grievance group, be it Asian Americans, Latin Americans, Black Americans, members of the LGBTQ plus community. The Black Lives Matters movement was distinct in that there were lots and lots of younger white folks, younger people of different cultural and ethnic backgrounds. And that's what really, I think, unnerved a lot of people, that this was looking like the potential for a very, very broad coalition. And it reflected the sense that more and more people saw these random acts of violence, these random instances of violence, as part of a broader pattern of injustice that oftentimes, again, and I want to say first and foremost, police have a very difficult job to do. Their job is to protect and serve, but oftentimes the culture of policing, and remember, policing is predominantly a matter of state and local government. Most police organizations in the United States exist at the local level, some 18,000 county and municipal police forces. And they oftentimes develop distinctive subcultures, and oftentimes those cultures are either guardians or warriors, and guardians generally do a pretty good job because they understand that their job is to protect and serve. Warrior subcultures oftentimes get caught up in kind of a more almost paramilitary approach to law enforcement, and oftentimes their first resort is to violence in dealing with problems. Again, when you see the number of times that police get called on mental health crises and end up killing the person that they're supposed to intervene and protect, this is a reflection of the difficulties inherent in policing, where oftentimes, again, they have to make split-second decisions, and oftentimes, tragically, those decisions result in people getting killed. Strategies used by social movements, again, different social movements will employ different strategies to pursue goals. On the one hand, you have insider strategies, which involve, again, the use of, these are groups that have access to resources like money, lobbyists, lawyers, folks that have those kinds of resources can employ insider strategies where they go directly and petition the government, where people in government are more prone to open the door for those kinds of groups because they understand the power behind those groups. Outsider strategies are typically by groups that are outsiders, people who are viewed as oftentimes outside the political system and who lack that sense of respect within government. And they oftentimes will have to employ, kind of more confrontational, strategies, strategies like sit-ins and marches and protests. So again, well-resourced groups can oftentimes pursue both strategies simultaneously, and that is, we can call that kind of a full court press, where they're going after both politicians individually and institutionally, but they are also seeking media attention by adopting protests and outsider approaches to government. Of course, the Black Lives Matter movement initially was, of course, an outsider movement, but they were able to attract, skilled lawyers like Benjamin Crump, who has sort of, leveraged his access to victims' families into becoming kind of the go-to guy when there is a civil rights violation against people. Again, one of the most important things to try to do for civil rights protests is to try and shift public opinion. Part of the reason why the civil rights movement of African Americans in the 1960s was successful was their ability to shift public opinion, in that, frankly, they used protests and outsider strategies and confrontation, peaceful, nonviolent protest, to publicize the nature of the oppression that they were confronting in segregation of societies in the South. And Southern, municipal governments and Southern state governments responded by very publicly attempting to suppress those groups and those protests. And here again, it's very important to understand the role that the media played in kind of shifting public opinion. It's one thing for the New York Times to talk about a civil rights protest in sort of, kind of just journalistic terms. This happened at this time, at this place, and the police dispersed the crowd. Well, that kind of anodyne description doesn't capture the violence and the drama of what was happening at those marches. And it was the role that television played in giving people, a sense seeing that sort of brutality really had a powerful effect among many Americans in northern, northeastern United States, and also other parts of the United States, and many religious, many pastors from the Northeast went down to the South. Many students in northeastern universities traveled to the South to work on civil rights. Joe Biden claimed that that as a student, he went down to the South to work on civil rights. Another strategy is to try and influence the president. Again, part of the reason for the success of the civil rights movement was they had the March on Washington, and that had in 1963, and that had a significant effect. First on John F. Kennedy, the existing president, but also on his successor following his assassination, Lyndon Johnson. And Johnson was a uniquely talented politician. And once he decided that the country needed a significant civil rights legislation passed, he had spent a long time in both the House and the Senate. It was said of Lyndon Johnson, he knew where all the bodies were buried in Washington, D.C. And he was uniquely, effective in compelling, and leading Congress in the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And again, that leads to the idea of legislation, right? The eventual success of the civil rights movement in pushing Congress to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964 illustrate the challenges confronting civil rights social movements. The South, the southern states had sent people to Congress whose primary mission was to prevent passage of any kind of civil rights legislation. And so overcoming that, that opposition reflects the challenges that contemporary civil rights movements face. The current hostility among Republicans for the idea of wokeness, this idea that you are awake to social injustices, and the wave of anti-woke legislation at the state level illustrates how even when civil rights groups succeed, they often confront a reactionary backlash from opponents. Finally, you'll see that civil rights aspirations can be served by Supreme Court decisions. The 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, which guarantees to each citizen equal protection under the law, again was for many years interpreted as in a very narrow way. So for much of American history, women and certain ethnic groups have struggled to secure support in the form of Supreme Court decisions. An important question is where the burden of proof lies. That refers to the legal responsibility of an individual, organization, or government to provide sufficient evidence in support of a claim in court. Currently, government actions that establish disparate treatment of individuals based on race are subject to what is known as strict scrutiny. And that means that the court views that those kinds of disparities as automatically unconstitutional, which shifts the burden of proof on the government to justify that behavior. History has also demonstrated that pursuing a court-centered civil rights strategy can be limited, again because reactions against Supreme Court decisions might provoke a state and or local backlash. Supreme Court decisions have the most effect when public opinion has already decisively shifted in favor of the objectives of a civil rights movement. And again, the success of the civil rights movement is that they moved in kind of a successive way. First, to confront the injustices at the state and local level, to get those state and local governments to overreact, and then to shift public opinion, and then move politicians, gradually in direction of supporting where the public had moved on a particular issue. The The civil rights movement, going again from the 16th century or 17th century to the 1960s. Again, these are, first of all, for much of that period of time, you are looking at the actions of government that provide the foundation for civil rights claim. And again, that is the fact that the Constitution, as it was originally written, tolerated slavery. The fact that women had no legal status within the Constitution at the time of ratification. The fact that for much of our history until well into the 20th century, certain groups were viewed as not eligible for citizenship because they were not white Europeans. So you really have this uneasy coexistence. You have this pervasive ethos, this ideal of individual liberty existing along a really dark history of slavery and then subsequently legalized racial discrimination. Again, as I mentioned in our discussion of the Constitution, the 3/5 Compromise and the parts of the Constitution that dealt with slavery really reflected a pragmatic compromise over the institution of slavery, because the reality was at that time that attempting to do away with slavery would almost certainly have undermined the ratification of process for the Constitution, and our history would have been very different had the Constitution not been ratified. So many civil rights arguments, many civil rights advocates argue that the roots of civil rights lie in the roots of slavery in the colonial era. The first shipment of slaves arrived in Jamestown, Virginia in 1619. The whole 1619 project kind of reflects that sense in which that is an historically important date, where again the institution of slavery was insinuated into the colonies. Now, it didn't actually work out in the northeastern part, the northeastern colonies, simply because the kinds of labor that existed, that were dominant in those states, simply were not congenial to slavery. However, large-scale agriculture, where you're growing tobacco and sugarcane and ultimately cotton, were very congenial to chattel slavery. Slave-owning states very quickly reached a tipping point where they had effectively created a slave-based economy. And, not to be a determinist, an economic determinist, but the fact that slavery lay at the root of Southern economies really produced significant social and political consequences. The state governments were organized around protecting the social and economic foundations of their states' economies. That also had social implications in the establishment of a highly militaristic, authoritarian set of governments dedicated to prevent slave uprisings and, within the federal government, to protecting the institution of slavery within the broader United States. The abolitionist movement had its origins in religious revivals of the early 19th century. That actually gave rise, the Great Awakening kind of gave rise to these serious questions about the morality of slavery. One of the big break within the Baptist Church in 1845 was over slavery. Where Southern Baptists basically simply broke away from the Baptist Church over questions related to the legitimacy of slavery. That gave rise also to to abolitionist movements, predominantly in the North, but also in the South. The Underground Railroad was conducted by Southerners as well, helping to get escaped slaves out of the Southern states and into the northern states, where they would be not as subject to rendition, but ultimately to Canada oftentimes. the attempts to there were a variety of compromises that were formed, the Nebraska Compromise, the Missouri Compromise, that were all kind of designed to manage the challenge of having a constitution that tolerated both kind of a nascent capitalist economy, but also an economy based on slavery. And the ultimate kind of failure of those attempts to reach a compromise occurred with the Supreme Court's decision in Dred Scott v. Sanford, where a Supreme Court predominantly comprised of pro-Southern justices basically concluded that there were that blacks had no rights, that a white man need respect, that they were inferior, and that they could be reduced to servitude for their own good. That was a Supreme Court decision that was designed to settle the matter of slavery. In fact, it only intensified the conflicts between like free soil advocates that were moving to the west into places like Missouri and Kansas, and to pro-slavery advocates that were also moving into those states, and where again the argument, attempt to resolve the conflict was that you would allow for popular sovereignty, which allow the people of the state to decide. Well, that created an enormous incentive for pro-slavery and pro-independence people, pro-abolitionist people, to start killing one another, and that was really one of the many of the first shots of the Civil War were fired in Kansas in the late 1850s. So we ultimately fought a civil war over the issue of slavery. I mean, again, Confederate sympathizers today would argue that they were actually fighting over federalism. The reality was federalism was controversial because the institution of slavery was so central to those southern states. And so in the aftermath of the Civil War and the victory, and keep in mind, part of the reason why the North defeated the South was that the North simply had greater mobilizational capacity. In no small part, the South's commitment to slavery undermined their war effort. But also, it's important to keep in mind, the North had more soldiers. They had a larger industry. They had a greater capacity to produce the sinews of war. They built an ironclad navy that enabled the North to basically encircle the southern states and prevent the movement of goods and material that could have helped the South wage the war from getting into the country. So the North ultimately defeated the South in the Civil War, and the result was what many historians now are describing as a second founding, where the Constitution was fundamentally revised through 3 amendments that were all ratified in from 1865 to 1870. 3 fundamental revisions to the Constitution that were predominantly passed by Republicans in that period. The 13th Amendment was ratified in 1865. And abolished slavery and involuntary servitude within the United States and all jurisdictions subject to U.S. law. Over the course of Reconstruction, and as they began to work to give civil rights or civil liberties, extend civil liberties to Black Americans, they recognized that the southern states were going to systematically deny them citizenship rights. And so that led to the ratification of the 14th Amendment, which is the most consequential of the constitutional revisions. In Section 1, again, and I've probably read this before, but it says, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the law. It also, basically says it creates a process for excluding people from government, from eligibility for governmental service, anyone who had risen in insurrection against the United States government. That was one of the things that some people were trying to argue about with Donald Trump, where I think it was the state of Colorado that actually held a legal process, held that Donald Trump had engaged in insurrection and therefore was disqualified to run for president of the United States. They were planning to remove him from the ballot. Ultimately, Trump appealed that decision to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court struck down Colorado's action and basically held that the process for exclusion had to be impeachment rather than a state, rather than on a state-by-state basis. Because, what would have happened then? There was argument in Ohio to remove Joe Biden from the ballot. That's just not workable as a way of managing these kinds of partisan conflicts. And so finally, you get the ratification of the 15th Amendment in 1870. And that, again, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Each of the Civil War amendments also included what were known as congressional enforcement clauses, empowering Congress to pass legislation as it related to the legal language of those amendments. Okay, so these are incredibly important revisions to the Constitution. I would make the argument that there are really three of the 27 amendments, or well, the 17 amendments ratified since the Bill of Rights, that are immensely consequential. One of them being the 14th Amendment. Another one of them being the 16th Amendment for different reasons, because it profoundly expands the capacity of the federal government to bring revenue in through income taxes. And then finally the 19th Amendment, which gives half the adult population the right to vote. I think the 15th Amendment is a close fourth, but I think the 19th Amendment is incredibly consequential because it extends to women a political right that they had previously been denied. So Reconstruction, the Reconstruction Act conditioned the readmission of the states, the former states of the Confederacy, on ratifying the Civil War amendments. In other words, in order for Georgia, Alabama, and the other states that had seceded from the Union, which the Union rejected on legal grounds. They said you couldn't legally secede. Once they had defeated the Confederacy, however, they said, okay, you were out, and now in order to come back in, you must ratify the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Another aspect of the 14th Amendment that I should mention is that it basically says the federal debt shall not be questioned. Okay, because there was fear that, of course, the Democrats would come in, they would be able to compete, they would win control of Congress, and they would repudiate the debt that the Union had accrued, mostly to American banks in the Northeast, from honoring those debts. And so when we see these debts, these debt shutdowns and arguing that we should repudiate the national debt, the 14th Amendment forbids that legally. So that's another important thing to keep in mind. Reconstruction took place. Again, what was Reconstruction? It was basically the occupation of the states of the former Confederacy by federal troops, by Union troops, and it lasted from 1865 to 1877. During that brief period, blacks gained considerable power in those southern states. The first black senators were elected from southern states. I believe the first black senator to serve in the federal Senate was from Louisiana. The problem, of course, was that it was short-lived because you had an enormous amount of war weariness. And the Southern, political elites, again, these were the large planters who continued controlling most of the land. There was no serious agrarian reform in the aftermath of the Civil War. And these very powerful and very wealthy people began working, even during Reconstruction, to actually, reassert political control, and with political control over the states, to begin systematically eliminating the newly won political rights of blacks in those southern states. So it's important to view the period, the post-Reconstruction era, as a kind of ideological cold civil war, right? Think about the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, except it was internal and it was ideological in nature, and it was driven by the Southern urge to, the Southern obsession with justifying their actions and defending their right to continue to control their state politics and to engage in systematic discrimination and subordination of blacks within their states. Okay, so very soon after Reconstruction, Southern whites reasserted. They began, they found ways. Oftentimes, they used violence to suppress the votes of black Southerners. And then once they won control of state government, they began, a whole process of sort of, again, rewriting history. Many of the statues that are now being debated being removed came about in the post-1877 period to the 1920s. These were, statues to Stonewall Jackson, to Robert E. Lee, to, other heroes of the Confederacy. There was, on the main boulevard in Richmond, Virginia, a series of these statues that again, to Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy during the Civil War. And, as much as those monuments were reminders to white Virginians and white Southerners of the lost cause, it was also a signal to black Virginians and to black Southerners everywhere that they did not have rights under the government that had seized back control. And so, white, Southern governments, state governments very quickly passed laws like grandfather codes and poll taxes and literacy tests to exclude blacks from the political process. There were laws passed that basically said that a black person couldn't serve on a jury trial where a white person was the defendant. Poll taxes. Most blacks were forced through a series of, again, machinations to engage in what was known as sharecropping, where they lived, a very kind of hand-to-mouth existence. They didn't have enough land to farm to make a profit. They had to sell their crops to certain people. Usually, it was the person that leased the land, which was oftentimes their former owners. And again, that kept them in a state of poverty. And then there was also kind of the informal mores of what became known as Jim Crow, where if a black man was walking on a sidewalk and a white woman was approaching on the same sidewalk, they must step into the street and take their hat off and bow to the black woman. Failure to do that would have undoubtedly led to that person being beaten severely or killed. When addressing a white man, they could not speak first. They had to wait, and again, they'd have to sit and kind of bow. And if the person addressed them, they had to call them sir or mars or master. That sort of symbolic subjugation was an essential aspect of the ideology of segregation. And so you also had the Supreme Court consistently in that period, interpreting the 14th Amendment, the guarantee of equal protection under the law, in very narrow ways. And of course, the culmination of that was the decision in Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, where the court ruled, and again, the argument was, this was the case dealt with segregation on rail travel. A lot of back in the day, a lot of movement of people occurred by railroad. And in Louisiana, they had a law basically saying that black people could not sit in a white car. They had to sit in a coloreds car reserved for coloreds, which usually had animals and straw strewn around on the floor. Oftentimes had human waste, or not human waste, but animal waste in amongst the hay. And a guy named Homer Plessy, who was a mulatto who looked white, challenged the provisions of that law, and it was a test case. He was arrested under the provisions of that law, and the case ultimately went to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court infamously concluded that states could segregate on the basis of race, provided that they also established separate but equal facilities. Now, again, it was patently obvious to everyone that separate but equal was not. It was separate, but it was certainly never equal. And again, the states were basically making the argument. They were making a public safety argument that race mixing would inevitably lead to violence. And so Plessy's separate but equal rule implicitly accepted that claim. Judges generally accepted the claim by states that separate facilities were also equal, but oftentimes they never were. In a public fountain, you would have a nice, marble fountain for whites to drink from, and then a tap on the side that was much smaller and off to the side, and would have a sign over it, for coloreds. You would have, schools. Black schools were crumbling, poorly constructed. Only very poorly educated teachers were allowed to teach. The books were out of date. And so they were systematically denied an adequate education in that period. So again, the idea of Jim Crow was to resubjugate the black population. Jim Crow was also enforced by extensive extrajudicial violence. And again, during that period, from 1877 to 1950, there were over 4,000 lynchings of blacks. And fewer than 1%. In fact, there used to be, they would string up a black person who had committed some imaginary offense, oftentimes being accused of rape. More often than not, they were simply viewed as a threat to the white power structure. And there would be mobs of white people who would grab these people up and beat them savagely and then hang them from a local tree. Oftentimes, they would have pictures. They would take pictures proudly posing around a lynched black person. Fewer than 1% of the people involved in lynchings in that period were ever convicted of a criminal offense. And so this really amounted to a long period of racial terrorism. Okay? The National Association for the Advancement of Black People, the NAACP, was established in 1909 in the aftermath of a riot in Springfield, Illinois, where a white mob sought to lynch two black men, again, who had been accused of raping a white woman. The resulting riot caused the Illinois governor to turn out the National Guard. 8 black men and 6 white rioters were killed in the violence. And again, the fact that Illinois was dealing with these kinds of racial horrors, well into the 20th century. You would have what they would call race riots that were more often than not mobs of white people killing black people. In Detroit, out many places out west. Again, wherever black people would go looking for work, working class whites would view them as a threat and would attack them. And so as a result of that, the NAACP formed. And again, the NAACP was trying to work an insider approach to changing public opinion in support of anti-lynching laws. And the main strategy the NAACP used was first publicizing incidents of racial violence, and then using the courts to challenge the basis, the unequal status of blacks in America. One of the main avenues was within education. The early focus in the 1930s was on the inequities of segregation. That basically, again, they're saying the Supreme Court says it can be separate but equal. But we're not equal because we don't have the right to form our own, core of professionals within our black communities. We don't have a right to black doctors. We don't have a right to black dentists. We don't have a right to black lawyers. We don't have a law school in the South, right, that serves black people. And so the NAACP is focusing on that aspect of segregation, basically saying, you want to keep us separate, we have to have these professionals. So we have to have access to black education. This is where you saw the rise of historically black colleges established in southern states, in North Carolina A&T, Morehouse College, Grambling State, all of these many universities, South Carolina State. These were established by state governments, basically saying, okay, we'll give you that. They were chronically underfunded and struggled to do the job needed to provide education for blacks. And that, what more importantly, they could not provide advanced degrees. Okay, and so again, the initial focus of the NAACP was on higher education. And so, for example, here in Oklahoma, you had, I can't remember the name, but there was a black gentleman. He was 60. He already had a degree that he had earned somewhere else. He wanted to go to law school at the University of Oklahoma. They consistently tried to, they said, you can attend class, but you have to sit outside the classroom. You have to sit outside the door. So they set up a desk for him. They set up a separate place for him to eat his lunch. Again, isolating him and engaging in that kind of implicit discrimination and saying that you are other. Okay? Ultimately, the NAACP began a class action lawsuit on public education generally, and this is what resulted in the landmark ruling in Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. And this was a class action lawsuit that began, it's called the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, but it was also several other states, including South Carolina, Virginia, and Alabama. I think there were 5 ultimately others where lawyers, black lawyers within those states came together with the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund to sponsor a class action lawsuit that all got bound up together. And again, the lawyers for the NAACP, led by Thurgood Marshall, who would later, a hero of the civil rights movement, who would ultimately become a Supreme Court justice himself, they confronted a problem, and that is the precedent worked against them. And in American common law, precedent is binding unless a compelling reason can be shown to break precedent. And so not being able to rely on the law, the NAACP lawyers went to social science, and they found a study conducted by 2 black sociologists. It was called the Dahl Study. And these sociologists were basically studying black children at play, and they gave them various dolls with different skin tones and different hair color. And what they found is the children gravitated towards the white dolls. And when they were interviewed afterwards and they were asked, why they why they wanted to play with the white doll, they found that those children had internalized white norms of beauty and acceptability and respectfulness. And so the black dolls that looked like them were scorned, and the white dolls were favored. And these sociologists were able to demonstrate how stigmatizing it was for black children to be internalizing this public discrimination. Now, importantly, the Supreme Court had changed in composition over the course of the Brown decision. The case was earlier argued before a court that was comprised predominantly of New Deal justices, but many, at least one, Fred Vinson, the Chief Justice, was an avowed segregationist. However, he dropped dead of a heart attack during the case. And at that point in 1954, Dwight Eisenhower was in his first term of office, and he had made a promise to California's governor, Earl Warren, that he would give him a position on the Supreme Court. And when Fred Vinson died, he initially went to Warren and said, "Can I name you Associate Justice and elevate another person?" And Warren said, "Nope, that's the position I want." And he became Chief Justice in 1954. They heard re-arguments and ultimately came down with the decision in Brown versus Board of Education, which was a 9-0 decision that basically held that in the place of in public education, segregation has no place. And so a major legal underpinning of segregation in southern states was yanked out by the Supreme Court. And this is, again, a full decade before Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And that's when the civil rights movement really begins to fight, because at that point you see the rise again of reactionary pro-segregationists who vowed absolute, blanket resistance to the Supreme Court's decision. So even as school boards began to eliminate de facto school discrimination, or de jure discrimination, you saw extensive de facto segregation persisting in both the North and the South. In the South, it followed a particular pattern. And what was happening was, at the municipal level, at the county level, white parents were taking their children out of public schools and putting them into private schools, which were being funded by wealthy Southerners. They basically had free tuition for white kids, and they basically just denied admission to black children. And so the South also began systematically cutting the budgets for public K through 12 education. Okay? So segregation as an edifice of discrimination remained untouched in employment, public accommodations, juries, voting, etc. In the South, Southern white politician, again, won elections, promising massive resistance to desegregation and expressing a generalized hostility to the federal government. George Wallace, it's an infamous name today. George Wallace in the 1930s was actually an FDR federal judge. He was a district court judge in Alabama, and he was in most ways a progressive. He was a Southerner, but he was relatively progressive. He was a progressive Democrat in the 1930s. By the late 1940s and 50s, he was going into politics, and he ran as a sort of moderate for governor of Alabama again, as a moderate Democrat. He lost to a racist Democrat named Thomas Patterson, who basically, shouted the N-word all over the place and vowed, to resist segregation. George Wallace, learning his lesson, basically his applause line for his conclusion for his next stump speech was segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. He vowed to stand in the steps of the University of Alabama to prevent the integration of the University of Alabama. And so people won elections in this period basically by vowing, and again, I think the anti-federal government animus among Southern politicians today has its direct root in this period of time. So the NAACP had done what it could to combat, using an insider strategy to combat segregation. Ultimately, what would happen is you would see a more Southern-based, the NAACP was based in New York City. It got a lot of its money from Northerners. And so what actually arose in the 1950s was a Southern-based kind of religiously inspired civil rights movement, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. The arrest of Rosa Parks, who was a secretary of the NAACP in Montgomery, Alabama. She was arrested for refusing to give up her seat on a bus to a white man. That, again, was a galvanizing event that led to the really kind of the nationalization of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference as a rival, sometimes complementary civil rights force within the civil rights movement to the NAACP. Now the problem was, again, the Montgomery bus boycott was started by this sparking event, a black woman being arrested. She worked at a store, and her feet hurt. She didn't want to have to stand for her ride home, and so she just basically said no. She was exhausted. And so the problem was, again, that this was a church-based movement. It was led by a young, pastor at the Dexter Avenue Church, which was one of the largest churches, black churches in Montgomery, Alabama. Churches were one of the few ways that blacks could actually, could move as an institution where they could all go and kind of do collective things. And again, that was judged, within the South, that we can't deny them access to a religion, And the Dexter Avenue Church was one of the most respectable churches in Montgomery, Alabama. And Martin Luther King was at the time, I think he might have still even been in his 20s, but he commanded a special respect within the black community. First, because his father was a very powerful pastor in Atlanta, Daddy King, and also because he had earned a PhD, a doctor of philosophy in theology from a northern university. And so he was, viewed as having a special kind of authority. And he was able to, get the black communities of Montgomery. And I say communities because you had the working class community of the people that went to Dexter Avenue Church, but then you had all the other working class communities that actually, rode the buses to go to work. And it was a serious, burden for them to not use the bus lines. Okay, the buses were also a major source of revenue for the city of Montgomery. And so blacks used the bus lines very heavily. That boycott was particularly effective, first, because people within the Southern Christian Leadership Conference reached out to the black community. They went to the juke joints outside of town where blacks would drink and congregate. And they were able to get universal discipline in terms of walking to work rather than starting an hour earlier, leaving work and getting home an hour late, in order to maintain that discipline. And it so damaged the city of Montgomery's finances that they ultimately capitulated and basically integrated the bus lines. That was an enormous victory for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. It dramatically raised the profile of Martin Luther King. He ultimately won the Nobel Prize for Peace, which gave him resources to, first it gave him money, right? It comes with a large monetary prize. It also gave him the ability to go to northern cities and to speak to blacks and to get money for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Okay, so again, ultimately, the Supreme Court found that segregated busing, and that was ended in the South generally, right? And that was, again, an enormous achievement. But then they tried to move to Birmingham, and there they ran into, again, a lot of trouble. And you get another civil rights movement, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, which began challenging the whites-only service in places like Woolworths and other kind of delis and diners and places like that. And again, you had historic participation from the historically black colleges and universities. Starting with the sit-ins, SNCC activists also engaged in the Freedom Rides, challenging segregated interstate busing in 1961. Again, there was a great deal of violence associated with those Freedom Rides, and it again began turning public opinion in the North against this discrimination in the South. Finally, in 1963, you get the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. It was again organized by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Over 200,000 demonstrators attended to raise public awareness. Again, at that event, Martin Luther King gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, which again, what was so notable about "I Have a Dream"? He was basically using this metaphor of a dream to say that blacks simply want to be judged by the content of their character. He was not arguing for some special status for blacks. He was arguing for blacks to be treated like Americans. That was the power of that appeal. And it had a very strong impression on John F. Kennedy. Kennedy and his brother Bobby, who was the Attorney General, saw that speech and saw in Martin Luther King a force that needed to be reckoned with. They recognized that they needed to deal with Martin Luther King. And they also recognized that it was going to complicate John F. Kennedy's bid for re-election, because appearing to be too sympathetic to civil rights of blacks in the South would cost Kennedy the southern states. And Democrats needed the South in that period in order to win the presidency. So Kennedy was assassinated, Martin Luther King was assassinated 5 years later, Robert Kennedy was assassinated 5 years later. In 1965, the civil rights movement had the Selma to Montgomery marches. The first march was organized by SNCC activists and were met with violence by state troopers. John Lewis had his skull cracked by a state trooper, hitting him with a police baton. Martin Luther King and other Southern Christian Leadership Conference leaders then participated in another march 3 weeks later. Again, at this point, the white political power structure recognized that what they were doing was counterproductive. They allowed the march to go forward. Over 25,000 people took that march from Selma to Montgomery. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was sort of a culmination of all these efforts. And again, it had to overcome enormous resistance from Southern Democratic politicians, members of Congress. Again, in practical terms, the Civil Rights Act prohibited segregation in all public accommodations. Title IV of the Civil Rights Act authorized the Justice Department to implement court orders desegregating public schools. Title VI of that act authorized withholding of federal education grants for schools that practiced racial segregation. Title VI was also the most effective tool for desegregating public schools outside the South. It identified patterns or practices of discrimination in northern cities where residential patterns reinforced segregation. The Supreme Court, the federal courts began ordering desegregation. In some cities like Boston, it was incredibly contentious and violent. The Supreme Court from the 60s forward has had a mixed record on desegregation. In their recent decisions, the Supreme Court has effectively said that efforts by school districts to integrate schools were unconstitutional. And John Roberts, in a stunningly obtuse way, basically said the way to end segregation is to end segregation, which is tautological and dumb. And basically insensitive to the realities of resegregation in American public education. Here we can see the rights of the civil rights as a social movement, how litigation and protest actually contributed to change. The NAACP's campaign resulted in Brown versus Board of Education. The Little Rock Nine, again, which is another important event in 1957, where the NAACP got 9 black students to integrate Little Rock Central High School, which again created the Civil Rights Act of 1957, and also caused Dwight Eisenhower to federalize state troopers to basically visit Little Rock Central High School and ensure the safety of those black students. Voting rights. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 basically barred literacy tests and set criminal punishment for election interference. The significance of Section 5 of the Civil Rights Act, of the Voting Rights Act, was that it basically said that if a district had previously been found to have engaged in discriminatory behavior, it had to seek pre-clearance from the Justice Department before making any kind of changes related to election law. You also got the 24th Amendment, which abolished poll taxes, which again were a major tool of voter suppression in the South and in some other states. Also in 1975, you had legislation. If you ever get a chance to vote, you will find that you can get a ballot in Spanish or in numerous other languages. It depends on the nature of minority communities. You can get a ballot in Vietnamese here in Oklahoma because of the Hmong community here in Oklahoma. And so the 1975 law basically mandated bilingual or oral assistance for non-English speaking Americans. So you've had a number of advances and retreats on voting rights. In 1972, the racial gap in registration between whites and blacks in the South had shrunk from 44% to 11%. Today, more black people hold public office in states of the Deep South than in the North. Reflecting, again, part of what has happened in the South is that the Democratic Party has increasingly become the party of blacks, which was the strategy of Republicans. Because blacks are a minority in many of those states, it makes it harder for Democrats in the South to reach out to whites in order to get electoral support. The Supreme Court handed down a decision in Shelby County versus Holder in 2013 that basically held that the preclearance section of the Voting Rights Act was unconstitutional. And that has given rise to a massive spate of voter ID laws, which has effectively reduced voting turnout among certain minorities. Again, what does a strict voter ID law do? It basically means you have to produce either a birth certificate or a driver's license. And again, many low-income Americans, many minority Americans don't drive. Many elderly Americans don't drive because they have their licenses taken away from them because of health concerns. And so if you're an elderly black person and you no longer are able to drive, and you had a house fire 20 years ago and your birth certificate burned up, what kind of a form of ID can you get? In some states like Texas, they'll allow a fishing license to count as ID, but they won't allow a university ID card. The argument being that, again, sometimes non-residents, file for, our students at a Texas State University. It's easy enough to resolve that, simply require the universities to have a box to say that they're a citizen of Texas and that they're eligible to vote. Again, strict voter identification laws reduce voting rates of select groups of Americans, and those groups of Americans tend overwhelmingly to be Democratic voters. In employment, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 makes it illegal to discriminate in employment based on color, religion, sex, national origin, and race. The Civil Rights Act created the Justice Department's Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, otherwise known as the EEOC. I think it's now just called the EOC, to investigate and prosecute employment discrimination. The use of federal contracting has often got these kinds of strings attached to them, so that companies that are found to engage in discrimination against any of those groups listed above, they can be denied access to federal contracts, which can oftentimes be very lucrative. So there's a very difficult burden of proof for plaintiffs in discrimination. You have to be able to prove that a group of people are discriminating against you in order to sustain those kinds of claims. In housing, the Fair Housing Act of 1968 basically prohibited housing discrimination. This was something that got Trump, former President Donald Trump, in trouble along with his father, because it came to light that he was denying tenancy to black and other minority groups to his apartment complexes. So again, it's very difficult to combat de facto patterns of residential segregation. Amendments to the Fair Housing Act of 1988 strengthened enforcement mechanisms by enabling the Department of Housing and Urban Development to initiate housing discrimination lawsuits. Finally, in the area of marriage, as of June of 1967, 16 states outlawed miscegenation, which was interracial marriage. Ultimately, Richard and Mildred Loving, they basically were married. They moved back to Virginia. They got married in D.C., moved back to Virginia. They were arrested for being an interracial couple. In Loving versus Virginia, 1967, a 9-0 Supreme Court held that anti-miscegenation laws have no legitimate overriding purpose independent of invidious discrimination. And Loving would serve as the precedent for striking down state same-sex marriage bans more recently. So that's it for this presentation. When we come back, we will continue our discussion of civil rights in American government. I'll see you next time.